the palace doors opened to a moment of calculated tradition and royal pageantry. Yet, within moments, whispers turned to a collective intake of breath as Princess Catherine made a move that was entirely unforeseen. This was not a regular gathering. It was a formal ceremony weighted with history, where the monarchy's public image was to be curated and showcased for the world. Every detail had been orchestrated to project continuity and calm, with Queen Camilla at the very center, poised to secure her long-sought validation. But from the start, there was a palpable sense of unease that no one could quite articulate. Camilla stood tall, ready to cement her authority before the watchful eyes of both courtiers and the public. For her, this day represented the culmination of years of struggle, scandal, and survival. She had fought against the whispers of being an interloper, endured constant comparisons to Diana, and now stood resolute to claim her rightful position beside King Charles. Yet beneath her carefully composed smile, a current of tension lingered. Her grip on power was strong, but not absolute. She knew that one wrong step, one subtle shift in perception, could undo the fragile acceptance she had worked so hard to secure. Then Catherine entered, intentionally late, yet radiating a quiet confidence. She commanded every gaze in the room without uttering a word. Unlike Camilla, she did not need to command acceptance. It followed her naturally, as if it were a part of her essence. She moved with a confidence that felt less like an act and more like destiny. The kind of presence that left courtiers whispering and onlookers wondering if they had just witnessed the real turning point of the event. It was not just an entrance, it was an arrival that fundamentally altered the balance of the room. From the moment Catherine stepped inside, a profound silence fell, broken only by a muffled cough or the shuffling of feet. It wasn't just that she was late. It was the way she held herself, with her chin high and her expression composed, as if she knew the world's attention was now hers. Camilla's composure wavered for the briefest instant, just enough for the most attentive observers to notice. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her eyes, a sudden realization, perhaps, that her role as the centerpiece of this grand affair was no longer secure. William's gaze followed his wife with an unwavering intensity. He didn't move, but his eyes conveyed something deeper, an awareness that Catherine was no longer content to remain in the shadows of tradition. Princess Anne, ever the sharp observer, leaned slightly forward, as if anticipating the drama about to unfold, and Charles, caught between pride for his son and devotion to his wife, shifted restlessly in his seat. The atmosphere was transforming, charged with a potent energy that neither protocol nor etiquette could contain. It was more than a mere presence, it was defiance embodied, an unspoken declaration that Catherine had chosen this day, this ceremony, to make a statement. Where others saw a formal show, she saw an opening. Where Camilla sought approval, Catherine sought truth. Her every step echoed not just on the palace's polished floors, but in the hearts of those watching, as if something sacred and irreversible had been set in motion. As murmurs rose from the crowd, the tension intensified. It was no longer simply Camilla's ceremony, it was becoming Catherine's battleground. The clash between tradition and destiny had begun, and everyone present could feel it building, second by second, breath by breath. But no one yet understood the storm Catherine was about to unleash. Her defiance wasn't subtle, it was about to be delivered for the entire nation to see. This confrontation wasn't born in a single day. It was the result of years of quiet rivalry, of Camilla's grip on power clashing against Catherine's steady emergence as the true future queen. Their story is not a tale of sudden rebellion, but of countless unsaid battles, glances heavy with significance, and carefully chosen words that cut deeper than any public outburst ever could. What the world witnessed at the palace ceremony was simply the eruption of a fire that had been smoldering for years, its embers hidden beneath royal courtesy and curated smiles. From the moment Catherine entered the royal family, Camilla sensed a threat. Unlike herself, who had fought for acceptance through decades of public criticism and scandal, Catherine was embraced almost immediately by the public. Her grace, humility, and quiet dignity seemed completely natural, while Camilla's every action was weighed down by the shadows of her past. The late Queen Elizabeth had watched this stark contrast with sharp eyes, and while she tolerated Camilla, it was Catherine who truly earned her trust. Catherine's loyalty was absolute, her respect for tradition unwavering, and her image as William's steady partner grew into something larger, something untouchable. It was this silent comparison that stung Camilla the most, for she knew Catherine represented everything she could never become. Behind closed palace doors, the whispers only deepened the divide. Senior figures began to murmur that Catherine carried the essence of Elizabeth herself. A quiet resilience, a sense of duty that didn't need to be stated. Some even claimed that Princess Anne, hardened by a lifetime of serving the crown, had quietly taken Catherine under her wing. In hushed conversations, there were rumors that even Charles, despite his devotion to Camilla, recognized Catherine's remarkable ability to command respect without demanding it. Such mentoring, subtle as it was, only fueled Camilla's suspicion that the palace was preparing Catherine not just as William's wife, but as the very face of the monarchy's future. Jealousy gnawed at Camilla. The public's adoration for Catherine wasn't earned through years of struggle, it was effortless, spontaneous, and unforced. Crowds lit up in her presence. Children ran to her without hesitation, and the media portrayed her as the nation's jewel. For Camilla, who had endured relentless battles to secure even a fraction of legitimacy, Catherine's natural rise felt like a profound insult. And though she smiled in public, in private her anger grew, and with it the rivalry between them hardened into something unbreakable. The division extended beyond the two women themselves. Within the royal households, lines were drawn. Staff whispered loyalties, some drawn to Camilla's hardened resilience, others swayed by Catherine's undeniable magnetism. What appeared to be smooth palace operations was in truth a fractured environment where loyalty could determine one's fate. Quietly behind locked doors, Camilla's household and Catherine's household operated with a tension that was palpable, like two armies waiting for the moment the first sword would be drawn. That sword was unsheathed on the day of the ceremony. For years, Catherine had played the part of the beautiful royal, never stepping beyond the bounds of protocol, never challenging Camilla openly. But time had altered the balance. The nation was watching, the monarchy was in a fragile state, and Catherine knew that remaining silent was no longer an option. What better stage to reveal the truth than a ceremony intended to display unity? By choosing this moment, she not only shattered the illusion of harmony, but declared that the era of quiet deference was over. And so, with years of tension boiling beneath the surface, Catherine's decision to act was more than defiance. It was destiny waiting to unfold. As Camilla reached for the spotlight, Catherine rose from her seat, her voice calm, but thundering in its authority. What she said would echo through the walls of history. For a moment, the entire room froze as if time itself had stopped to bear witness to this single act of defiance. Courtiers gasped audibly, their whispers swallowed by the crushing silence that followed. No one expected Catherine to stand, and yet there she was, commanding the floor in a way that generations of royal women had been told never to attempt. This wasn't the quiet diplomacy of backroom discussions. This was a direct interruption of protocol, a deliberate shattering of tradition that left even the most hardened officials staring in disbelief. The ceremony meant to elevate Camilla's presence was suddenly hijacked by Catherine's rising power. Her words were delivered with precision, not rushed or reckless, but carefully chosen to cut through centuries of ritual. She did not stumble, she did not hesitate. She spoke with a composure that made her sound less like an intruder and more like the true guardian of the monarchy's legacy. And when she addressed the crowd directly, bypassing the established hierarchy and custom, the silence grew heavy. Never before had a royal consort dared to break the invisible barrier that separated ceremony and reality. Catherine was not asking for permission. She was asserting authority. The tension thickened as Catherine framed her words not as rebellion, but as loyalty to the crown itself. She invoked duty, responsibility, and the sacredness of the throne. Her voice carried conviction. And in that conviction was an unspoken accusation that the crown could not be tarnished by personal ambition or gain. It was not a direct attack on Camilla by name, but the implication was unmistakable. The lines were drawn for everyone to see. For Catherine, this was not defiance against the monarchy, it was defiance in defense of it. And in that defense, she gave herself an air of righteousness that left no room for dismissal. Then came the emotional weight that pierced even deeper. She evoked the memory of Queen Elizabeth, a figure of unbroken duty, whose shadow still loomed large over the palace. Her words carried the late Queen's spirit, as though Catherine were channeling Elizabeth's own quiet authority to remind everyone what true leadership looked like. But she didn't stop there. With a deliberate pause, she invoked Diana, the woman whose legacy still haunts the crown. By aligning herself with both Elizabeth and Diana, Catherine did what Camilla could never do. She stood as the bridge between the past and the future, embodying the two figures who defined the monarchy in the public's heart. Camilla's face betrayed her shock. The confidence she had worn into the ceremony evaporated, replaced with the unmistakable look of someone completely blindsided. Her body stiffened, her eyes flickering with disbelief, realizing in that instant that Catherine's stand was no spontaneous moment of passion, it was calculated, prepared, and intended for maximum impact. This was no mistake, no emotional misstep. It was a public statement that reverberated like thunder across the palace walls. And as the silence deepened, broken only by the uneasy shifting of feet and the thudding of anxious hearts, it became clear that this was not just a moment in ceremony, but a turning point in history. Catherine had not only seized control of the event, she had shifted the balance of power in full view of the world. But Catherine's words weren't just bold. They carried a hidden meaning that shook even the closest members of the royal family. To the public, Catherine's statement seemed to honor protocol. But those who listened closely heard something else, an unmistakable challenge to Camilla's authority. Her words, delivered with an almost ceremonial calm, carried a sharp undertone that could not be ignored. On the surface, she had spoken of loyalty to the crown, of preserving the sacred trust handed down through generations. Yet within that loyalty was an exclusion, a deliberate suggestion that the guardianship of the monarchy's future lay not with Camilla, but elsewhere. It was subtle, veiled in the language of tradition, but its intent was clear enough for those who knew the undercurrents of royal politics. Catherine had not only interrupted protocol, she had redefined it. The phrase that resonated most was her reference to the crown's true heirloom. To some, it was merely symbolic, a nod to the weight of responsibility. But to those who understood the coded language of the monarchy, it was something more. The crown's true heirloom was not Camilla, nor the validation she sought, but the bloodline that flowed through William and their children. It was a poetic yet pointed reminder that the monarchy's survival depended on legitimacy, on future generations born of Diana's son, not on the woman who had fought for acceptance from outside that lineage. Catherine never named Camilla, but in those few words, she effectively erased her from the chain of inheritance. There was also something fiercely protective in her tone, a maternal strength woven into the speech. While outwardly defending the monarchy, Catherine's words seemed to shield her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, from the shadow of a contested throne. Her voice carried a warning: no compromise would be allowed when it came to their destiny. To the ordinary listener, this could have passed unnoticed, but to the seasoned eyes of courtiers, the message was unmistakable. Catherine was speaking for the future of her family as much as for the crown itself. And by doing so, she established herself not as a consort, but as a defender of the monarchy's survival. The audience's reaction revealed just how deeply her words had cut. Some offered hesitant applause, unsure if they were witnessing courage or insolence. Others sat frozen, unwilling to be caught in what could later be interpreted as a betrayal of Camilla. The room fractured in silence, and that silence was more telling than thunderous applause ever could have been. for in it lay confusion, fear, and awe, emotions that only surface when history is being rewritten before one's very eyes. Senior royals exchanged glances that spoke louder than any speech. Anne's face betrayed a flicker of recognition, as though she had long anticipated Catherine's rise. Charles, meanwhile, sat stiff and unmoving, his eyes darting between his wife and his daughter, in-law torn between personal loyalty and the undeniable force of Catherine's words. Even seasoned courtiers shifted uneasily, realizing they were watching a balance of power tilt in real time. Outside the palace, the media wasted no time. Within minutes, whispers turned into headlines and headlines turned into firestorms. Analysts and reporters seized upon Catherine's phrasing, dissecting every syllable, sensing that this was not merely a statement, but a declaration. Catherine's crowning moment, some declared, while others framed it as a deliberate humiliation of Camilla. Either way, the narrative had shifted. The ceremony, once meant to elevate Camilla, now belonged entirely to Catherine, and while the audience struggled to process the shock, Camilla's response, or lack of it, spoke volumes. For a woman who fought her entire life to be seen as queen, Camilla's silence in that moment wasn't just shocking, it was devastating. She had endured decades of scrutiny, endured ridicule, and clawed her way from the shadows into the palace itself. Every step had been a battle, every smile a shield against criticism. And yet, when confronted publicly by Catherine's thunderous words, Camilla found herself stripped of the armor she had spent years forging. Her voice, the one weapon that could have defended her position, never came. She froze, rattled to her core, and in that stillness, the image of strength she had tried so desperately to build began to collapse before the nation's eyes. The silence did not last long, but it was enough. Within seconds, what should have been Camilla's crowning moment became the stage of her undoing. The courtiers, trained to read power shifts in the smallest gestures, immediately recognized what her silence meant. In their world, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was fatal. Catherine had spoken with clarity and control, while Camilla stood mute, unable to muster a single word of defense. It was not merely that she had been interrupted, it was that she had surrendered the stage entirely to her rival. The absence of her voice became the loudest sound in the room. And as she struggled to maintain composure, the weight of her past pressed against her like a cruel reminder. She had spent years fighting to prove she belonged. Facing a public that never fully forgave her, facing comparisons to Diana she could never erase, facing whispers that she was tolerated rather than loved. All of those battles, all of those scars came flooding back in this one moment of humiliation. Catherine hadn't just challenged her authority. She had reopened every wound Camilla had worked to conceal. The emotional toll was plain to those watching. The woman who had spent her life defying odds now looked defeated, undone by silence. Around her, the palace air thickened with whispers. Some voices murmured in Catherine's favor, praising her courage, declaring that she had spoken what others had only dared to think. Others remained paralyzed, unable to align themselves too quickly, fearful of choosing the wrong side in a conflict that might soon define the monarchy itself. Even the most loyal supporters of Camilla felt the sting of doubt as they watched her falter. For if she could not defend herself now in this pivotal moment, how could she possibly withstand the battles yet to come? Camilla's family, gathered in proud anticipation of her triumph, could do nothing but watch in horror. Their expressions betrayed the pain of helplessness, their pride turning to grief as they realized she was powerless against the force Catherine had unleashed. Their presence meant to strengthen her only deepened the humiliation for her in front of those who loved her most. Camilla's authority disintegrated, and Catherine, with her calm poise, only grew stronger. Her dominance was sealed not by further words, but by the glaring contrast between her resolve and Camilla's silence. In that imbalance, the crown itself seemed to shift toward her. The future no longer belonged to the woman who had fought to claim it, but to the one who had stood up to protect it. Catherine had seized control, not with aggression, but with conviction, and Camilla's inability to respond made that conviction unassailable. But behind the quiet collapse, a storm was already brewing. Because Catherine's defiance wasn't over yet. While Catherine stood tall, William's expression revealed more than words ever could. Because this wasn't just her defiance, it was their strategy. From the moment she rose, his eyes followed her with quiet intensity, not with surprise, but with the composure of a man who knew exactly what was coming. He did not flinch, nor did he attempt to restrain her, and in that stillness lay the first signal to everyone watching. This was not Catherine acting alone. This was a united front, carefully measured, quietly orchestrated, and deliberately timed for maximum impact. The monarchy had always been defined by pairs, Elizabeth and Philip, Charles and Diana, and now, before the eyes of the world, William and Catherine were showing themselves as the pair that would define its future. Throughout the ceremony, William's subtle signals had been overlooked by most, but not by those who understood the language of power. A slight nod when Catherine's words gained strength, a tightening of his jaw when Camilla attempted to reassert her poise, even the firm stillness of his body. These were not accidents, they were cues, hints that he was not only supporting his wife, but silently endorsing her message. It was his way of declaring allegiance without uttering a single word. The palace had pressured him time and again to remain neutral in conflicts that threatened to expose rifts within the family. Yet in this moment, William chose not neutrality, but loyalty to Catherine and to the destiny that awaited them both. Rumors had long swirled that Catherine and William operated as more than husband and wife. Behind closed doors, they were seen as strategists, partners who carefully weighed each move. Whispers suggested that this confrontation was not born of impulse, but of calculation, discussed and rehearsed in the quiet safety of their private chambers. If true, it meant that the defiance Catherine had unleashed was not only hers. It was a shared decision, a declaration crafted by both, aimed at reshaping the monarchy itself. For the first time, the public was not only witnessing Catherine's strength, but William's willingness to wield it alongside her. Yet, even in his quiet solidarity, William was torn. His heart was split between two worlds, the duty he owed his father and the protection he owed his wife. Charles was not just the king, he was his father, a man whose approval William had sought his entire life. But when Catherine stood, William did not waver. He chose her not out of rebellion against his father, but because he understood that Catherine's stand was in truth the future of the monarchy. To deny her in that moment would have been to deny the inevitable shift of power. And William knew too well that hesitation could fracture everything they had worked to build. The crowd felt the impact of his choice when he rose to stand beside Catherine. It was subtle, almost understated. Yet the symbolism was undeniable. No longer was this a solitary act of defiance. It was the joint authority of the future king and queen, standing shoulder to shoulder before the nation. The applause that followed was fractured, some hesitant, others bold. But the sight of William and Catherine united sent a message no one could ignore. They were not merely hares waiting in the wings, they were already commanding the throne in spirit, if not yet in title. Camilla, shaken and cornered, realized the true depth of the confrontation. She wasn't battling Catherine alone. She was staring down the combined force of William and Catherine together, the very embodiment of the monarchy's future. Against that unity, her own position seemed fragile, her silence heavier, her composure faltering under the weight of inevitability. The power she had fought for suddenly looked temporary, a fleeting claim overshadowed by the permanence of what stood before her. And yet, William's support only deepened the divide, pushing Charles into an impossible position. Charles's face told a story of heartbreak and fury, because in that moment, he was forced to choose between the woman he loved and the son who would inherit his crown. He had been blindsided by Catherine's audacity, her words piercing through the rigid fabric of tradition with the precision of a blade. This was not how the day was meant to unfold. The ceremony had been crafted to reinforce unity, to cement Camilla's standing. Instead, it had exposed fractures so deep they threatened to split the monarchy itself. Charles, usually shielded by layers of formality, now stood exposed in a raw and impossible conflict for all to see. He glanced at Camilla, her silence weighing heavier than any speech could have. He could feel her trembling rage, the sting of humiliation burning behind her composed facade. His instinct was to protect her, to shield her from the collapse that was playing out in full view of the palace. This was the woman for whom he had sacrificed so much, the woman whose presence beside him was both a triumph and a wound. His loyalty was not in question. He had fought too long to make her his queen. Yet duty whispered in his ear, reminding him that beyond Camilla stood William, the heir to the throne, and Catherine, the woman who had just proven that she could command the crown's respect with nothing more than her voice. The palace seemed to hold its breath as the conflict unfolded across his expression. Every eye was trained on the king, waiting for a gesture, a word, anything that could tilt the balance. And still he hesitated. His lips moved in a whisper meant only for Camilla, a desperate attempt to steady her. Perhaps he told her to hold firm. Perhaps he begged her not to break. But whatever he said, it was not enough. Her composure faltered further, and in the silence that followed, the court saw not a queen rising, but a queen undone. And yet Charles's gaze betrayed him. Time and again he turned toward William and Catherine, his eyes falling on them with something dangerously close to recognition. He could see what everyone else now saw, that their unity, their strength, had already shifted the center of power. Though his crown remained firmly on his head, the weight of it felt lighter, less secure, as though slipping inch by inch toward the very couple who stood silently, resolutely before him. He was torn not only by love and duty, but by inevitability itself. In that single moment, centuries of tradition trembled. The monarchy, so often portrayed as an unbreakable institution, now appeared divided, its fault lines exposed in front of the world. One side tethered to a past that refused to let go, the other pulling toward a future that demanded to be acknowledged. And Charles, trapped between them, could no longer pretend that compromise was possible. His very silence testified to the split, a crack that would echo long after the ceremony ended. But what no one knew was that Catherine's defiance had been carefully prepared with a final revelation that would leave Camilla humiliated. The air grew heavier, the silence unbearable, and then Catherine delivered the words that sealed Camilla's fate in front of the world. With her voice steady, measured and impossible to ignore, she invoked the memory of Queen Elizabeth, calling her reign an unbroken legacy of service and sacrifice, carried faithfully through William, and destined for generations yet to come. The choice of words was deliberate, each syllable a reminder that the true line of succession lay not in contested titles or fragile claims, but in the blood of her husband and the children they had brought into the world. It was a declaration disguised as reverence, a final blow, veiled in loyalty. The weight of the message landed like thunder. Catherine had not needed to name Camilla directly. She had instead removed her entirely, erasing her presence from the narrative of the monarchy's future. When Catherine spoke of the sacred duty of coronation, reserved for those born to inherit, not those who arrive by circumstance, there was no mistaking the implication. It was a statement that Camilla's role was temporary, ceremonial at best, and had no place in the unbroken line Catherine had just sanctified. In that moment, the unspoken truth became unavoidable. Camilla was not the future. She was the past. The audience was stunned. Some gasped openly, unable to mask their shock. Others, in defiance of royal protocol, broke into applause, their clapping hesitant at first, then louder as the words sank in. The breach of etiquette itself revealed the depth of their emotions. Never before had a future queen commanded such a reaction within the walls of ceremony. What should have been a moment of order had become a stage for rebellion, and Catherine's words struck a chord that resonated far beyond the palace walls. The unity the day was supposed to symbolize was gone. In its place stood a new vision, one that the people instinctively recognized. Camilla, cornered and humiliated, could not endure the pressure. Tears welled in her eyes, and as the weight of silence pressed down on her, she lifted a hand to cover her face, breaking under the scrutiny of those she had hoped to command. Courtiers rushed to her side, desperate to shield her from further disgrace, but their actions only underscored the moment. Camilla was not leading, she was being consoled. Her composure crumbled in real time, unraveling before the very audience she had sought to convince of her authority. Meanwhile, Catherine stood unmoved. Her calm poise was striking, her expression composed and unwavering, a perfect counterbalance to Camilla's collapse. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The strength of one woman against the unraveling of another. In that juxtaposition, the hierarchy shifted, not by decree or crown, but by sheer force of presence. Catherine had claimed authority not by asking for it, but by embodying it. Her every word and gesture declaring her the true future queen. This was the defining moment, the point where speculation hardened into certainty. Catherine's declaration was not simply a defiance of Camilla's role, it was the unmistakable announcement that she, alongside William, would lead the monarchy into its next chapter. The crowd knew it. The courtiers knew it. Even Charles, with anguish written across his face, could not deny it. Catherine had seized control of the narrative, and in doing so, she had rewritten the balance of power before the nation. And yet, even as the ceremony ended, the echoes of Catherine's defiance promised consequences far beyond that single room. The ceremony was over, but its impact had only begun when Catherine's defiance against Camilla would forever alter the monarchy, the family, and the nation. What had started as a formal display of tradition ended as an unprecedented rupture that the press seized upon with unrelenting force. Within hours, newspapers and broadcasts across the globe echoed a single refrain: Catherine's crowning moment. Analysts debated the implications. Commentators replayed her words, and the world realized they had not just witnessed an interruption of protocol, but the emergence of a new royal order. What was meant to showcase Camilla's authority had instead cemented Catherine's dominance. The public's reaction was swift, but far from unified. To some, Catherine's bold stand was nothing short of heroic, a long-awaited correction that reaffirmed the monarchy's rightful future. They praised her courage, calling her the embodiment of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, and Diana's spirit, a woman unafraid to challenge what they saw as misplaced ambition. Crowds outside the palace gates carried signs of support, their cheers declaring Catherine the nation's true queen in waiting. Yet not everyone agreed. Loyalists to Camilla voiced outrage, calling Catherine's actions insolent and divisive, a reckless gamble that exposed private fractures to the eyes of the world. The division was stark. The nation split between two camps, those ready to crown Catherine in their hearts and those clinging to Camilla's fragile legitimacy. Inside the palace, the tension was unbearable. Courtiers whispered of shifting loyalties, alliances forming and dissolving in real time. Some who had long stood behind Camilla quietly began aligning themselves with Catherine, sensing the inevitability of her rise. Others hesitated, fearful of abandoning the woman who still wore the crown, however tenuously. Behind locked doors, the atmosphere was not of celebration, but of suspicion and unease. The carefully polished facade of unity was shattered, leaving exposed the very divisions Catherine had forced into the light. Every glance, every word spoken in those corridors now carried the weight of potential betrayal. For Camilla, the blow was devastating. Though no official announcement was made, her influence in royal affairs began to wither almost immediately. Invitations that once flowed freely slowed to a trickle, and her presence, once insisted upon, was quietly overlooked. She had not been stripped of title or position, but something far more damaging had occurred: she had been stripped of relevance. Symbolically, the monarchy had already moved past her, and even those sympathetic to her plight could not deny that her authority had been fatally weakened. In contrast, William and Catherine's image soared to new heights. They were no longer viewed simply as heirs to the throne, but as its guardians, protectors of a legacy that seemed under siege. Their unity at the ceremony, the silent solidarity, the calculated defiance, etched them